Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to be taking a review of New Cold Wars by David Sanger. It's a rather thick book. He works for the New York Times, so it does read a little bit like investigative journalism. Because it is investigative journalism. I just want to preface this also by saying, at this point, I think I've read double-digit number of books on Russia vis-a-vis U.S. relationships in kind of a more contemporary past 30 years period. And so, to whatever extent I confuse the information with one book with another, that's a consequence of that. But with that said, the book largely is covering the past 30 years with both these nations in terms of their relations with the U.S., and this is kind of an okay book for getting up to speed on that, but it does take a very strong emphasis on the first few years of the Biden administration before the book was published. I think it was published in 2024. So, with that said, the kind of overall theme of the book is that we are experiencing a sharply changing trajectory with these two nations, Russia and China, and that this is going to be one where they're increasingly adversarial with the U.S. I think Russia is a little bit more obvious because they are invading a neighboring state in Ukraine, and that this has been something that the preservation of international borders has been something the U.S. has obviously been committed to post-World War II, and so with this, we have kind of a disruption of the world order that has been established under the U.S. And then China's a little bit more subtle, or I think people are generally really misinformed on China, both in terms of its economic potential and what it has going on, viewing China as being very backward when they are establishing technologies at a rate faster than us in some instances, and also that China just wants to act as an exporter and just do economics where they have, I forget the date of the inflection point, I think it's 2010, 2015, they have taken an increasingly belligerent stance as they have emerged as someone that can kind of, let's say, step out of the shadow of the United States because they are sufficiently large and sufficiently large a player. So with that said, the kind of movement away from this world order where we respect borders is a large kind of source of concern. For those of you who are familiar with post-World War I, there was a lot of spheres of influence and a lot of stomping underfoot of the great powers or by the great powers of other countries, and this is perhaps a state of international order that we might return to if this turns belly up to some degree. And since the publishing of the book, I think it's becoming, the United States has lost a lot of its strength in the sense that the allies of the U.S. are one of the ways in which it is able to derive and project power and have soft power and this type of things. And I think increasingly the United States has alienated its allies. So I do this review with a sense of uncertainty and dread. And so getting into it a little bit, don't want to try and summarize it all because it's a very lengthy book. With regards to Russia, it was a bit interesting so we got coverage of how Russia is kind of meddling with the United States internally, and then also a coverage of how the United States is involved in Ukraine. Won't kind of summarize that, but a couple things I thought interesting was that he reports on specifically Biden's approach, and that this was intentional of boiling the frog in regards to sending aid to Ukraine. Now, the boiling the frog analogy is, as far as I know, kind of like a debunked metaphor, but the metaphor or idea is that if you throw a frog into a boiling water, they will jump out immediately, but if you put them in it's cool water and you turn up the heat slowly, they will allow themselves to get boiled alive. If you throw a frog into boiling water, that will probably just kill them, and if you turn the heat up, they will just jump out. And so there was an author that apparently looked into this, let's say, and discovered that, no, the analogy is silly. But the analogy gets used in the book, and the way in which it was implemented in regards to sending aid to Ukraine was intentionally starting with relatively low-impact aid with the intention of slowly turning it up so that the frog doesn't jump out of the water or, so that Putin doesn't escalate with the West and the rest of NATO, a kind of a slow escalation, which is to the how should I say? There's differing incentives in regards to the U.S. and Ukraine in a lot of spots, and the book kind of covers that, and that is somewhat interesting. Like, avoiding Russia retaliating against the U.S. with something kinetic is something the U.S. cares about more than Ukraine. But with that said, there's also quite a bit of coverage on the evolving state of warfare, how Russia was not very successful in the beginning, how Russia learned and implemented a lot of the strategies that were being used and has become much more competent in kind of the later portion of the war as it stands to now, or more recent, let's say, because not sure if it's later. There is a bit of coverage on drone warfare, which is very interesting, that this is kind of the increasing way in which warfare is going to be conducted. Also, there is coverage on accessing information, finding troops, this type of stuff. But increasingly, we're going to have drone warfare in these kinds of environments. And right now, kind of the status as of 2024 is that there's kind of a little bit of a stalemate. And although recently in the news, Ukraine got quite a bit of ground, but the stalemate, the kind of way that they cover it is that this is Putin has to try and, or the strategy from Putin's end is just to wait out the interest of the West supporting Ukraine. And this past year has not been very, or not just the U.S., but the West in general. I think I might have said U.S. West in general. Europe's now kind of carrying the entire brunt of it. I don't think that there was an aid package sent from the U.S., unsurprisingly, to Ukraine in 2025, and so increasingly Europe's going to have to step up, and if the Europeans decide that they don't want to help with this project anymore, then Putin gets to win. Other than that, it is kind of a stalemate-y type of conflict. And so that's the nature of the thing. Now, China is a bit more interesting. Or I think that it's easier to be misinformed on. In particular, I've read a different book about the development of China's economy and how much China has come along in this period of time. I think people don't have an appreciation for that, generally speaking, and they think China is backward or semi-backward. But the book talks about Sputnik moments. And in particular, Sputnik was an instance where the USSR beat the US in regards to the space race, although I think they beat them in regards to the space race in a bunch of spots. But the idea is that this was a moment of alarm in which the US is like, oh man, we're behind. This is bad. And so being the second person to hit milestones in a environment where you are evaluating the technology of two rivals or potential rivals or geopolitical adversaries, losing out on hitting the milestone is something that is spooky. And this is something China has started to do with the U.S. It's not necessarily clear that the author covers it, and they cover how this really alarms the U.S. and it leads to strategies of the U.S. trying to contain China, which of course China says, hey, they're trying to contain us. This is bad actor stuff, which there's an argument there. But in particular, the author makes the argument that we're going to see more and more of these, and the U.S. probably can't overreact, let's say, to each of them, but they do go into kind of some of the ways in which the U.S. has tried to contain China in particular on the front of chips and also with Taiwan. And this is where I think a lot of the argument is, or a lot of the discussion is placed. In particular, AI and chips are one of the fronts in which increasingly there is going to be areas of ingress, and most military technology is heavily reliant on these chips, and so development of better and better chips helps with the military technology, and also it helps with developing AI better. In particular, almost all the world's chips are produced in Taiwan, which China regards as its sovereign territory in terms of its territorial claims, and the U.S. under Biden, the U.S. has declared that it will defend Taiwan in the case of invasion. So, obviously, there's a little bit of a situation there, and so that does get discussed at some length as well. Regarding the chips, we see kind of multiple things going on, as both China and the U.S. are trying to detach themselves from dependence on Taiwan in regards to chips, because China's dependent on chips as well. If China attacks Taiwan, they're going to also lose chips because Taiwan is just going to destroy the factories in response, and this will just cause massive economic upheaval in addition to, obviously the invading of another country. And so this is a bit of a thing in terms of, I think we discussed it a little bit, but containment, the methodology of containment and the CHIPS Acts and this type of thing does get discussed quite a bit at length throughout the book. It's very interesting that the fabricators for these chips apparently need to come from, there's one company that makes them. They're extraordinarily expensive, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, I think, in terms of the number for creating these chips, and you can't just set up a chip factory very easily, and that was something that was interesting to hear. In regards to China, another thing that was a bit interesting was this sort of, we're going to increasingly have separation with and decoupling with China's economy. And China has already tried or set about making their own kind of self-reliance, and the U.S. as well to some degree. And increasingly, we're going to see geopolitically, Russia is not an enormous actor in terms of having infrastructure for supporting the rest of the world coming on board with it. But with regards to the US and China, we're going to increasingly see two different internets, two telecommunication networks, and two economies as the US and China starts to decouple. And the United States and China kind of being economically dependent on each other has created an environment where a conflict between the two is really catastrophic for both. But as they decouple, that's less of a thing, and both sides are intent on decoupling and becoming less reliant on chains. Something that I think was interesting with COVID that doesn't really get discussed too much in the book is that COVID demonstrated that our supply chains are incredibly efficient, but not very resilient. And so disruption, in particular, just throws a massive wrench into things. And so we might see increasing dedication towards having more resilient supply chains and this type of thing. But to the degree that supply chains are disruptive to either China or the US as a result of the other, they're both trying to detach, and this is part of why the U.S. is trying to produce chips locally, because you can't make the military weapons and stuff without chips. They're essential for national security. Digital warfare is a bit of a topic. They talk about both the hacking attempts of both China and also Russia spying, this type of stuff. And so I think that that's kind of a roughish idea, I think, of what's going on in the book. Just contemporary geopolitics, particular emphasis on the first few years of Biden's administration in regards to how China and Russia are adversaries. It does talk quite a bit more about Ukraine, but I didn't want to talk about Ukraine too much because I'm not sure if I'm going to accidentally reference information from other books. So, with that said, let's get into the ratings. For utility, I gave it a 2.5. I don't think that in your everyday life this is likely to be particularly useful, other than I think that being somewhat informed on what's going on geopolitically is useful. And so that's why it got the score that it did. I don't know if you necessarily need to have this. Just reading the news occasionally is probably okay. This is, I guess, to some degree a catch-up and a little bit more of a contemporary thing. The thing is, the landscape changes very, very quickly, and books get outdated very quickly on this type of thing, I have found. And so even towards the end that you're trying to become informed, it might not even be the most efficient methodology. For novelty, I give it a 3.5. The score is because I think that people don't have an appreciation, generally speaking. When I have everyday conversations with people, I feel that people really don't have any idea about what's going on in in Russia or China. And not only this, I think that they feel that they are confident that they know what's going on, and I think that it's probably a leak to not have read, or how should I say? I think that as a citizen and someone who should be concerned with the world because the world is going to affect them, knowing more than zero about geopolitics is a useful thing. I think that a lot of people know pretty close to zero, or a lot of people that I talk to in person and like encounter in person and this type of thing know close to zero about geopolitics, except to the extent that it informs partisan politics in the U.S. because I'm in the U.S. I think reading something that is a bit more in long form with more of an outside view rather than a reactive type of partisan hackery, I think that this is useful. I think it's useful because it gives you a better appreciation for what's going on. I'm not sure I would recommend this book the most highly. I think it's maybe a bit of a good catch-up type of book, but it's also quite long. I think that books that are more focused on technical information are maybe a little bit better. I reviewed a book like a few years ago about China's economy and the way that it's changed, in the past 40 years, and this book was written, 5-6 years ago now, so bound to see quite a bit more, and that was, I think, really enlightening and gave a lot more information and context and nuance. And I think that if you're accessing information just in terms of only what's going on, this is maybe a bit of a leak. But at the same time, what's going on in an immediate sense is going to be what's going on in an immediate sense. And so I think there's probably some degree of balancing act. I think that, it depends on how much people want to read and how much they want to become informed. But I think that reading some amount of long-form books on geopolitics is probably something that people should do. To that extent, this book fits in the category, although I don't know if it's the one I would most highly recommend. It is pretty long to have a little bit of a go at the topics. So, moving on for entertainment, I gave it a 4.5. The writing's relatively good. The guy writes for the New York Times. I found it generally readable. There's like an arc to the book. And okay, it's not entertaining from the perspective of it being like a riveting story, but it's an information-oriented book, okay? Style, I give it a 7, readability 6.5, kind of similar themes there where the book is solidly enough written. It wasn't, it's solid enough. And then, better than solid. The writing itself is good, and the information seems well vetted and like this type of stuff. And then for interesting, I gave it a 7. I think that this is a topic that's interesting. At this point, it's a topic that I've read a lot about, to the extent that I'm seeing a lot of the same information over and over again, and that is maybe less interesting. But that is not a knock on the book itself. And so as this starts to happen with topics, it becomes harder and harder for me to review them because I'm both confusing information, what book the information's from, by the time I read the book, especially with the book's over 400 pages. It's also, it's just, it's going to be less interesting like the next time you see it. There were some interesting things though, and in particular China I know a little bit less about, so kind of the changing pace of China and the loud kind of construction outside was a little bit of a novelty in that I did not have an appreciation for how aggressively China kind of pivoted, much to violating the expectations of other people. With that said, just general recommendations is don't record a video when the trash people are coming to pick up the trash. This is thing one. But also thing two, I think I would kind of broadly recommend this if people were interested specifically in what happened under the Biden administration and wanted to play catch up in terms of understanding what was going on. And outside of that, I don't have necessarily a suggestion for what I would suggest most, but I think that the length of this book is such that it's maybe not the most expedient way to get the information and this type of thing, although I thought the book was fine enough. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, feel free to like, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and other than that, have a good one. Bye-bye now.